As we've already kind of finished the content for this chapter, so that's good. What we'll do today is I want to spend a little bit more time taking some questions from the homeworks. So if you have anything that you want to ask about, we'll start with that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the test format and give you guys a chance to work on the last couple of assignments for this chapter, and that'll probably be about it for today. So it'll be fairly light, relaxed day. We'll take another day. The next class period after this one, we'll take some more questions from the reviews and whatnot, and probably start some Chapter 6 stuff. And then the following class periods for you guys, that would be Friday, we'll take our Chapter 5 test. So that's all up on the Power School calendar and on the bulletin board on Power School, but I figured it doesn't help to hear it in person also. So yeah, if you guys have questions, we can kind of start with those, whether they're specific homework questions or kind of general things or whatever. We'll just kind of start with some of the basics. So if you have anything you'd like to do, you can type them into the chat, or you can shout it out, or kind of whatever suits you. Okay. So 50 looks like our first one, and everybody can see my screen, right? It's been a couple of days, so I just want to make sure that I've got everything set up correctly, right? We're good there? Thumbs up? Okay. I just didn't want to start and not have, to do like half of a problem before somebody's like, Mr. Kulik, we can't see your screen. And then for me to be like, well, see, the thing is, okay, so this is 50. Hopefully, Kristen, that the obvious thing to do is to work on the left-hand side first. Since there's not much to do with the 2 over on the right-hand side, that would be pretty tough to sort your way through. You could do it, but you'd have to get pretty kind of sneaky and clever to do that. The left-hand side would be much more obvious, and there's no real identity that you could use here that's going to make life easier. Everything's already in terms of sines and cosines. Hopefully the obvious thing to do is like, well, let's get rid of these squareds. So to do that, what we're going to have to do is FOIL. So remember that a squared outside of a set of parentheses like that really means that we have something like this for each of them. So when I FOIL out the first set, cosine times cosine is cosine squared. Cosine times negative sine is negative sine times cosine, and negative sine times cosine is also negative sine times cosine, so I get 2 of those. And then sine times, or negative sine times negative sine is positive sine squared. And then similarly over here, kind of the same thing happens. Kristen, are we okay to that point?
Yes.
Okay. So at this point, I notice there's some nice like terms that I can combine. In particular, we have a -2 sine t and a +2, negative 2 sine t cosine t, and a +2 sine t cosine t. So those are just going to kind of add to cancel each other out. So if I look at what's left, then I have a cosine squared t plus a sine squared t. Well, that's just 1. That's using our first Pythagorean. And then if I look here, I have a cosine squared t plus a sine squared t. Well, that's also 1. And so I'm left with just 2 is equal to 2. Does that feel okay there? Kristen, we're good to move forward, or do you have a follow-up on that?
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, no problem. All right. So 56 is next. Let's see. And this is pretty good timing here on this question, Josh, because I'm going to use an observation that I made in Kristen's question as kind of insight for why I'm going to plan to do what I'm going to do here on this problem. Okay with that plan? So it comes down to picking a side to work on first. And I guess I would think that this side would be the better side to work on, because when I start seeing these +1s and -1s and stuff going on in the other one, to me the only way to get there is really to use one of those Pythagorean identities, and it's much easier to use one of those identities to get to the 1 than it is to turn the 1 into sine squared plus cosine squared or something and just try to like fiddle my way backwards doing that. So I'm going to work on the left-hand side. Is that okay, Josh?
Yeah, that's what I did.
Okay. And here's the observation that I made. So if I look at this piece here that we had in the previous problem, that would simplify down to exactly this, right? Because the sine squared plus cosine squared just turns into the 1. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. And where did that come from? That was cosine plus sine times cosine plus sine. So that's going to tell me what I'm going to do as my initial step, is I'm going to multiply the top and bottom of the left-hand side by sine plus cosine, because I know it's going to give me the denominator that I need, and then I'll hopefully be able to sort out the numerator after that. So I'm going to erase that and move it up here so I have a space to write that. Okay. So I'm going to have to FOIL here in both cases. So that's going to give me sine squared x minus cosine squared x in the numerator, just using that difference of 2 squares factoring pattern. And then, just like we did on the previous example problem, or homework problem, I guess, FOIL that one out. And that stuff all just stays the same. I don't feel like copying it down again, so I'm just going to put an equal sign and leave that spot blank as if it's just all coming down. And just like we had done with the previous problem, we know that sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. So kind of as we discussed there in the very beginning, there's our denominator now matching, right? So we have that part. What I need now is I need to look at the numerators. So the numerator I have here has only sine squareds in it and a 1, but the only trig identity, or the trig function, is a sine squared. My current numerator has a cosine squared in it. So what I would like to do is be able to find a way to turn that cosine squared into a sine squared. And I can do that. Remember that cosine squared is equal to 1 minus sine squared. That was the way we rearranged that first Pythagorean. Josh, are you good with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have to be a little bit careful here because the cosine squared was negative. So all of 1 minus sine squared needs to also be negative. So I'm going to put a parenthesis around it. And then just distribute that that negative through the parenthesis. And then sine squared and sine squared becomes 2 sine squared. And we have what we're looking for.
Okay.
Does that feel okay?
Yeah.
So the big trick here was, making this observation at the very beginning, right? Like if you didn't figure that out, that would have made life much, much more difficult. And again, it was kind of a nice coincidence having done 50 right before this, that it was fresh in my mind that, oh, that's how I can make a 1 plus 2 sine x cosine x, was just by foiling that thing out. So, was a tricky one, for sure. 58 is next. Okay. All right. So hopefully it should be pretty obvious that you'd want to start on the left-hand side here is probably the easiest way to start. Clearly that's much more complicated than the right. So when I look at this, I remember that secant is 1 over cosine. So I want to figure out a way to get the denominators of these fractions to have cosines in them. Now, there's a couple of different ways you could do that. So one way would be to simply multiply the top and bottom of each of those fractions by a cosine, which is not a bad idea. So maybe we'll try doing it that way. So I need to get a cosine in the denominator. There's no super obvious way to get that in there without just putting it in yourself, so we can do that. Alternatively, you could say that 1 plus sine looks like almost one of those modified Pythagoreans. So you could multiply the top and bottom by 1 minus sine x, and that'll FOIL out to be a 1 minus sine squared in the denominator. And similarly, for the other fraction, you could multiply the top and bottom by 1 plus sine x to get the same thing, and then turn those into cosine squareds. either is fine. I think this way is going to be a little bit neater for us, so I'm going to go this way. But it doesn't matter. There's another perfectly reasonable way of going about doing this that I mentioned just a moment ago. Okay. So it might be tempting to try to cancel the cosines, but you'd be right back to where you started, so you definitely don't want to do that. What we want to do is find a way to cancel the 1 plus sign and the 1 minus sign. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to take this cosine squared and rewrite it so that it has signs in it. Specifically, I know that cosine squared is 1 minus sine squared, as we mentioned earlier. Oops, got my cosine. Anthony, are you so far so good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So we'll keep going here. So here's the trickiest part now. 1 minus sine squared is a difference of 2 squares. So I can factor that to be 1 minus sine x times 1 plus sine x. Okay, and now we can do some reducing. So those can all reduce out now, which is nice. And if we look, the fractions that we have now have a common denominator of cosine. So we can now add these two fractions together quite easily. So if I do that, 1 plus 1 is 2. Negative sign plus positive sign is 0. And my denominator is just cosine. And that's really the same thing as like 2 times 1 over cosine, which is 2 secant, which is what we're supposed to get. Alternatively, if you had tried to just make a common denominator at the beginning, that would have been also perfectly appropriate, and you would have ended up in a similar place, right? Yeah. Yeah, that would have worked out pretty similarly. Any follow-up questions on this one before we move on to 54? Okay, if you change your minds, let me know. We can always go back and talk about something a little bit more. Okay. So 54, one of the things to figure out first would be the side to work on. And now it might be tempting to want to work on the right-hand side because you see 2 terms. But we also really have on the left-hand side, we have this squared here that's screaming to FOIL us out. And foiling is always going to be easier than factoring, which is what we'd have to do to get something with the squared on it, like a parenthesis squared on it. So I would choose to work on the left-hand side here, Teresa, and to FOIL this out as my first step. Is that okay with you?
That's good.
Okay. So when we do this, x times sine A, you get an x squared sine squared A. And then x times cosine, or x cosine A is x squared cosine A. And x cosine A times x sine A is another x squared cosine A sine A. So I have 2 x squared, 2x squared sine squared A cosine, just sine A, cosine A. And then the last one, x cosine A times x cosine A is x cosine squared A. X squared cosine squared A. There's a lot of letters in there. I'm sorry to kind of stumbled my way around that. Teresa, are you still happy with what we did there, though?
Yep.
Okay. So the piece that I'm interested in is this stuff, since we already have that in the answer that we're looking for. So I'm not going to touch that stuff in green because that's already in what I'm looking for. So I'm just going to worry about combining those two things in yellow. So I notice that there's a greatest common factor of x squared. So I'll factor that off. And what I'm left with is that Pythagorean, which just goes to 1. So I have x squared plus 2x squared sine A cosine A, which is what we needed. And we're all done. You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Happy to do some more if there are any more. If not, that's okay. Again, we have another day to meet, at the next time. So if you come across something else that you want to talk about, you can certainly cover it then. But if you have something you think of now that you want to talk about, I'm happy to do a little bit more. Okay, that's perfectly fine. So next thing is the Chapter 5 review. Let me go grab it, because I guess I didn't put it in here yet. Okay, so the review here, I want to talk about the first page, which is just kind of a description of the test format. So this test will be a little bit differently formatted. Oh, I'm sorry. Lauren still had something on 58. Let's pause this discussion. We'll go back and talk about that. 58. Okay. So, Lauren, you're asking when we combined like terms, 1 minus sign plus 1 plus sign, how that gave us 2. Is that correct, Lauren? That's what we're asking about?
Yeah.
Okay. So if we look at it, we have a negative sign and a positive sign. So those just become 0.
Oh, okay.
And then a
sorry.
1 plus 1 is a 2.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Again, like you get all that the trig functions in there, and it can get confusing. Like it's not a big deal. Happy to spend some time and run through and double, make sure all those I's are dotted and the T's are crossed and all that sort of thing. So, okay. So the review or the test format for this chapter 5 will be a little bit different. So you'll have 3 required questions. So the topics for those 3 required questions are going to be, like solving or find the trig function value using a reference triangle. So those are like questions like 1 through 6 from the homework, those very beginning things. And then use identities to find the value of something. Again, that's same thing as 1 through 6. Some of those we asked you to do it with a reference triangle, or some of them we asked you to do them with identities. Then there'll be to solve trig identities, which is like what we did on 15 through 46. And then to simplify a given expression, that was like what we did in the homework on 7 through 14. Sorry about that. My internet just dropped the Zoom call there for a second. Okay. Did you guys hear all of what we were talking about for these 3 required questions? Do I need to repeat it? I can, that's fine. Just if you don't say anything, I'm going to just continue on. Okay. So the second part of the test, I'm going to give you 8 of these verifying trig identity problems. So like 47 through 62, but you only have to answer 5 of them. So I know that sometimes these things can get a little bit tricky and you're not sure what to do with some of them, and some of them are like, oh, guess that was easy when I see you do it, but for the life of me, I looked at it for 20 minutes. I couldn't make any headway on it. So it allows you some freedom of choice to, focus on the ones you feel the most comfortable with and ignore the ones that seem the most difficult. So you can pick whichever 5 out of those 8 that you want. The proofs aren't going to be arranged in order of difficulty. Most of them are going to be fairly straightforward, easy, what I would consider easy ones that could be done in 2 to 4 steps if you're doing it kind of in the most efficient manner. But there could be a couple that maybe are a little bit more difficult than that. They're all worth the same. So pick the 5 that seem the most straightforward or the easiest to you. And when it comes to me grading, I'm going to grade the first 5 that I see. even if you leave one blank, so like if you're going to skip one, you need to just put a big X through it, or write not doing this, or write skip or something. And any extra ones aren't going to be graded, so really you only have to do 5. Like, you can work on more than 5 of them, but make sure you put an X through the one or ones that you don't want me to grade, that you're like, nope, my other ones are better than this one. Like, put an X through it. Is everybody okay with that idea as far as format goes? Hopefully that feels a little bit better than just like, I'm going to give you exactly 5 and you have to do these 5, where if something isn't obvious to you what to do, you're kind of stuck. This gives you a little bit of freedom to avoid some of the things that are maybe more difficult. So the review is all identities, and this was formatted in a way that gosh darn it. Welcome back. Zoom hates me today, I'll tell you what, guys. So this are... Yes. Yes, I'm listening.
Is the test online, or are we just doing it during the class period?
We're gonna do it during the class period. It'll be similar to like what we would do with a homework quiz, where you'll do it and then submit it to PowerSchool.
All right.
Okay.
Well, like, do we have to join Zoom that day, or?
Yes. Yeah, I'd want to do that. Just in case there's some mistake on the test, or you might have a question or something like that. I can at least, answer that and deal with that. If I made a typo on the test or whatever and I need to make a correction, it helps to have everybody here at the same place. But that's a perfectly reasonable question to ask, and that's really the only reason why I would ask you to all be at the same place at the same time. Okay. So the review here, you'll notice that it said like Team 1 and Team 2 and stuff on it. This was written as something that we would have done in class together with little groups. But obviously that's not really going to be possible. So you're just going to work on these on your own, so you can ignore the Team 1, Team 2, Team 3 things. I do want to point out that the review is only identities, considering the majority of the test points are identities. That's really what I packed it into. But don't forget there are 3 questions at the start of the test that are not involving identities, that would come from topics similar to the previous things that we've done in the homework. That being said, I also included, or am I going to ask you guys to do the worksheet 1, which is another solving sheet, just to get a little bit more solving practice. Some of these are a little bit trickier than maybe even some of the things that we saw in the homework, although they have only one part. You're just solving over one specific interval for each of them, rather than having like parts A, B, C, etc. Like, there's none of that stuff. And I've put the keys for the worksheets here up also, so you can, so you can check that stuff as you go. Okay. Are there any questions about the review or the test format or any of that stuff here? Okay, fabulous. Again, if something comes up, the test isn't till Friday, so we can always, you'll have another opportunity to ask me at our next class session. The last thing that I have for you guys to do today is I have a homework quiz that we need to do for Chapter 5. So I'm pasting that into the content library right now. And I'm going to sync this notebook. So this should be kind of populating through here in the next few minutes. So it's 3 questions. Once you've seen this, or just at some point today, please do this and get it submitted. Preferably, you know, like by the end of class today. So 9:05 or whatever, if you can submit this. I have a assignment on PowerSchool where you can submit it to a Dropbox there. Kind of doing the same formatting as before where you export this as a PDF would be best. But that's all I have today for you guys. I'm going to release you guys for the last, 30 or 40 minutes here so you can work on and finish this homework quiz and then start on the review stuff. And we'll see you guys on Wednesday. If you have questions on things as you go through, make note of it so we can cover that on Wednesday. But before you go, if you can type goodbye in the chat for attendance purposes, that would be excellent.